Welcome to Bible Time, episode 54. Today we're back on schedule with our Psalms. Last week we took a little bit of a detour into Psalm 23, going through that nice and slow and in depth, and today we are back. So we are into Psalm 15. So go ahead and read through that psalm with your family, pray over it, and we are going to be asking the question of how do we get to be in the presence of God? How can anyone be in his presence? So getting into verse 1, we have our superscription. Again, this is a Psalm of David, as has become so familiar and common in the first book in the Psalms. And he starts off by saying this. He says, "O Yahweh, who may abide in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy hill?" This tent here, this is the idea of God's presence in his tabernacle. And the question is, Lord, how can we be with you? How can we be in your presence? And really, this is the question of the whole Bible, but specifically the first 5 books. The Pentateuch is, we start off with Genesis, where God is with man, and we have the fall and the separation. And from Exodus, you see that God chooses a people for himself, and he brings them to Mount Sinai, where his presence is visible. But the people know, and the people themselves say, we can't be with this God. He's a consuming fire. We'll surely die if we are in the presence of God. And from that, we learn that stuff has to happen. Things need to be done in order for you to have communion with God. Right? And at the end of Exodus, God's presence comes down, but even Moses himself can't go into the tabernacle. And then the book of Leviticus shows all these steps and all these things that need to take place in order to be in God's presence in the tabernacle. And the book of Numbers shows how seriously the presence of God in your midst needs to be taken. Right? The people that are killed for doing it wrongly and rebelling against the Lord, and even the way that the camp of Israel is configured with God at the center, and he leads them when they move. The presence of God is a big deal. And then Deuteronomy reiterating all the promises that God has made and talking about the promise of a new heart and a new covenant where God will be with his people. So the whole Pentateuch is really about how can God again be with his people. So how can, who may abide in your tent, who may dwell in your holy hill? Your holy hill, we've already seen this idea in Psalm 2, verse 6, where God says that I have set my king in Zion, my holy hill. So again, this presence of God, where the temple is, where God's presence is manifest on earth. The question is, how can we be with this God? And we're almost set up to think about, Leviticus and the Pentateuch and, all these ceremonial laws and these cleansings and all this stuff. But that isn't what we have in the rest of this psalm. Right? So this psalm is the question of God's presence in this first verse here. But then the next question, or the next thing we see, is the prerequisite is God's standard. Right? This is the answer. Who gets to be with God? Starting in verse 2, it says that he who walks with integrity and works righteousness. Right? The person who walks with integrity is the person whose manner of life, the theme of their life, is consistent and is blameless and is upright. And the person who works righteousness is the person who makes the practice of doing what is right in God's eyes. Right? So these parallel ideas of the person who walks with integrity and works righteousness. And the next parallel idea here is the one who speaks truth in his heart. He does not slander with his tongue. Right? So you can say that this first part of verse 2 is, talking about the man who gets to be with God. It's talking about his ways. Right? And this next section is talking about his words. Right? Both what he speaks truth in his heart. This idea that even in his most inner desires, his intentions of his heart are truthful, and they're consistent with truth, which is God's standard of truth. And not only is he consistent in his own mind and his own thinking in honoring the Lord and being truthful, he also doesn't slander with his tongue. He doesn't speak secret things with his tongue. He doesn't speak secretly destructive things. So from the inside to the outside, his words and his thoughts honor the Lord. And we have more parallel ideas of God's standard. It says that he does not do evil to his neighbor. He does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friends. Right? This idea of neighbor and friends, these close relationships that he has. He doesn't do evil. Right? He doesn't he doesn't commit evil against his neighbors, and he doesn't take up a reproach against his friend. That means he doesn't start it and he doesn't continue it, right? He does not start evil against his friend, and he takes up no part in continuing evil against his friend. So we see that his ways honor the Lord, his words honor the Lord, and his relationship, right? The way he relates to people. And then even in verse 4, we see that in whose eyes a reprobate is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. Right? We have his response right here. His response to both sinners and those who honor the Lord. When this man who gets to be in the presence of God, when he looks out and he sees evil people doing evil things, he despises the practice of their life. He despises their practice of sin. Right? But when he looks at those who honor and fear the Lord, he honors them. So he has the right response and the right view of people in the world. And then this next line, he swears to his own hurt and does not change. Right? A person who is consistent, that if he makes an oath, he stands to it, he holds to it, his word is his bond, even to his own hurt, meaning even if it's not advantageous for him. He is consistent to his own word, and he does not change. He is firm, he's not wavering, he doesn't go with whatever gets him gain. And that kind of continues into this similar idea in verse 5, where it says that he does not put out his money at interest, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. Right? This money at interest, this idea goes all the way back to the law and how Israelites are supposed to relate to each other. And it's not wrong to, lend out money at interest. It's not wrong to be a bank or anything like that. But the corruption that comes with doing that, even to your own brothers, you're not supposed to take advantage of someone when they need help and when they need money to say, yeah, I'll give you money, but you need to pay this hefty sum in return. You're supposed to be merciful and give that money at no interest to your brother. And in the same way, he doesn't take a bribe against the innocent. That means that he can't be bought. You're not going to get him to make false witness against an innocent man with money. He's just, right? This is all relating to his justice. And so you have all these standards of this question, okay, who gets to be with God? If the goal is for God to be with man, if you can summarize the first 5 books as saying, okay, God is going to be with his people, right? God repeatedly says, I will be your God, you will be my people, and I will dwell with you. If that's the goal, and when David asks the question, who gets to dwell with God, who gets to be with him, and the answer isn't the person who makes the right sacrifice or the person who washes his hand, but the answer is the perfect person who's perfect in every area of their life, right? All this whole psalm just did a bunch of categories that show what you need to do and how you need to be perfect. But if we think back a couple weeks ago when we went through Psalm 14, it very emphatically states that there is no one who does good, right? And then again it says there's no one who does good, not even one. So this psalm, what hope can I have reading through this, that if I want to be in the presence of God, I have to do all these things perfectly? In my heart and in my life, every practice I have has to be perfect. What hope does that give me? Right? And it ends by saying the person who does these things will never be shaken. The person who does these things will never be shaken. If I look at my own life and the practice of my life, I can't say that I've done all these things. I can't say that I've never fallen short in every one of these areas. So what hope do I have to be with the presence of God? Well, my hope is that when I see, he who does these things, I can think of someone who did these things. Right? Jesus did these things. He lived perfectly before the Lord. And so when we think about what is our hope, even as we, consider our inadequacy, our inability to be before God on our own standards, we can think of Christ who did it on our behalf. Right? That when Jesus came in the world, when it says in John 1:14 that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, that the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, that this promise of God being with us, God came and lived with us. And not only that, there's a promise, right? That when we think in Revelation 21, verse 3, it says this, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. So we see this promise from the beginning, this hope that we get to be with God again. We see that Jesus came on earth and dwelt with us, and we live in this future hope that we will be with God even in the future. The question I have for you then is, what did Jesus do? What was so important about Jesus' dwelling with us that changed the status that we have? That we don't fall into the category of Psalm 14, the fool who says there's no God, and the one who there's no good, and we don't have hope because we aren't this standard of righteousness. What did Jesus do to change that? And to help you guys with that, we'll have a few passages to read through that explain that, and that will be your discussion over this psalm.
All right, that was episode 54, and the next one is going to be called Tommy is Bad at Math because I messed up the numbering. So we're going to have to call tomorrow's episode 54 and a half. Just go with it, please. All right, so Andrew was talking a lot about how we can be in the presence of God, how before the fall we were in the presence of God, how one day in the future we will be in the presence of God, and what did Jesus do to fix that? How are we going to be in the presence of God one day? Because we can't right now. So read up on it and read in Hebrews. That's the challenge for today. Hebrews 9, 12 through 14, Hebrews 9, 24, 10, 19 through 25, and 12, 28 through 29. So those are the four passages, and we will see you guys tomorrow.